And so I will now invite Professor Griffith Aled Williams to join us to talk about the notorious association, Owain Glyndŵr and Sir Edmund Mortimer, because the relationships between the Mortimers and the Princes of Wales had one more dramatic turn.
My name is Gruffudd Aled Williams, and my current main academic interest is Owain Glyndŵr, and I talked about the relationship between Owain Glyndŵr and Sir Edmund Mortimer. They met in battle, at the Battle of Pilleth, where Glyndŵr was victorious. Mortimer was taken prisoner, and eventually, indeed, in captivity, he married one of Glyndŵr's daughters. And I look at what followed from that marriage. Eventually, Mortimer died in the siege of Harlech Castle in 1409, and his wife, Catrin, daughter of Owain Glyndŵr, and Owain Glyndŵr's own wife, they were taken to London, to the Tower of London, where they died. And now, in fact, Catrin Glyndŵr is commemorated in a memorial garden, in St Swithin's Garden in London. But it's basically the relationship between Owain Glyndŵr and Sir Edmund Mortimer that I talk about. Well, I'm sure that by this time of day that you have been more than sated with learning, but I shall excuse if I see some of you nodding off. I won't take umbrage. Well, the notorious association of my title, or infamis conversatio in the Latin original, was the English chronicler Thomas Walsingham's description of the interaction between Owain Glyndŵr and Sir Edmund Mortimer. Sir Edmund was the senior member of the Mortimer family after the death in action in Ireland in 1398 of his elder brother, Roger Mortimer, 4th Earl of March. And now the outline of the story is well known. Sir Edmund's defeat and capture by Glyndŵr in the Battle of Bryn Glas at Pilleth in 1402, and King Henry IV's subsequent refusal to ransom him. Then Edmund's marriage to Glyndŵr's daughter, Catrin, and his defection to the Welsh cause. Mortimer's role with Glyndŵr and Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, in the Tripartite Indenture of 1405, which envisaged the partition of the kingdom, and Mortimer's death in 1409 in the siege of Harlech Castle by English forces, and the capture of his wife and children, who died in prison in the Tower of London in 1413. Well, my aim this afternoon is to put some flesh on the bones of this broad outline, or to change the metaphor, to inject some microhistory into the larger historical picture. Well, now, the pivotal event in relation to my topic is, of course, the Battle of Bryn Glas in 1402, which I'll eventually look at in some detail. But what happened after the battle was coloured by earlier political circumstances and history. Richard II, eventually deposed by Henry Bolingbroke, Count Henry IV in 1399, had been unable to produce an heir, either from his first wife, Anne of Bohemia, who died in 1394, or, understandably, from his second wife, the 7-year-old Isabella of France, whom he married in 1396. Now, speculation in such circumstances, speculation about the succession, should Richard die childless, was inevitable, and led during the 1390s to jockeying for position between potential candidates. On the one side was John of Gaunt with his son Henry Bolingbroke. Gaunt had long-standing designs on the crown. And on the other side was Roger Mortimer, 4th Earl of March. Mortimer, through his mother Philippa, was the grandson of Lionel, Duke of Clarence, the second surviving son of Edward III. Gaunt was Edward's third surviving son. When there was precedence to be given to birth order, which would have favoured Mortimer, issuing from a second son of Edward III, albeit through the female line, or to male descent, which favoured Gaunt and after him his son Henry. Despite Edward III's attempt in 1376 to 1377 to limit the succession to his male descendants by a process called entailment, the matter was far from settled. One chronicle, the continuation of the Eulogium Historiarum, uniquely recorded that Richard II got Parliament in 1386 to publicly proclaim the Earl of March as his heir designate. And heavyweight historians such as T.F. Tout, Anthony Tuck, Maud Clark, Rhys Davis and G.B. Stowe have all rejected this. The entry may be a later interpolation under Yorkist influence. But more recently, however, Michael Bennett, Chris Given-Wilson and Ian Mortimer have been much less dismissive of the entry. Another chronicle, the Westminster Chronicle, written in the early 1390s or earlier, tellingly recorded that if Richard were to die childless, the crown of England would devolve upon one of the two Mortimer brothers, Roger or Edmund. Rivalry between the contenders for the succession, Gaunt and Roger Mortimer, came to the boil in an open quarrel between them in the Parliament of 1394, after Gaunt had petitioned for his son Henry to be acknowledged as heir. The quarrel only ending after the king told them to be quiet. Now, indirect evidence of the rivalry for the succession is provided by the Fundatorum Historia, a Wigmore chronicle preserved in a striking manuscript in the University of Chicago library. I was lucky enough to see it about a quarter of a century ago. I think I remember the occasion, not only for seeing the manuscript, but my taxi driver in Chicago got lost on the way to the Chicago University. But anyway, it's marvellous. It is a marvellous manuscript. Written in Wigmore Abbey and a Mortimer patronage during the 1390s, its most important part was written between late 1399 and 1401. Its main matter is genealogical. It furnishes evidence of the Mortimers' descent from the royal dynasties of England, France, and Wales. In a detailed analysis of the work, Chris Given-Wilson has described its primary purpose as to make the case for the Earl of March to be the inheritor of the crown of England. The senior member of the Mortimer family between 1399 and 1401 was Sir Edmund Mortimer. His brother, Roger, Earl of March, had been killed in Ireland in 1398, and after Henry Bolingbroke had deposed Richard in 1399, Roger's heir, Edmund, a mere boy of 6 when his father died, was with his younger brother in virtual custody as a royal ward at Windsor. Now, the development of the chronicle between 1399 and 1401, when Sir Edmund headed the family, indicates that he, like his late brother, was not reluctant to promote the Mortimer claim to the crown. The usurper Henry's claim was contentious, and his position and a potential threat, whilst Mortimer ambitions persisted and whilst a Mortimer heir lived. Well, all this is relevant to my main topic today. My second set of preliminary observations concern Welsh attitudes towards the Mortimers. Even after Mortimer control over the Welsh territories of Meliennydd and Gwerthrynion, what later became northern Radnorshire, had been consolidated in the second half of the 13th century, generations of conflict would have fixed the Mortimers in Welsh popular memory as invaders and enemies. Yet, relations between the Mortimers and the Welsh were not one-dimensional. In the age of the princes, there were Welshmen who participated in Mortimer rule, profiting from it. We've heard today about Dr. David Stevenson's favourite, Hywel ap Meirig, constable of the Mortimer castle of Cefn-Llys, when it was attacked by Llywelyn ap Gruffydd in 1262. Hywel was later steward to Roger Mortimer, and the leader of a force from Mortimer and Bohun lands which attacked Gwynedd with Edward I in 1277. And as Dr. David Stevenson has shown in a recent volume, a number of his descendants, the descendants of Hywel ap Meirig, followed him in Mortimer service. And one aspect of earlier 13th century dynastic politics may have encouraged a more positive view of the Mortimers among the Welsh. I refer to the marriage in 1229 or 1230 of Gladys the daughter of Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, Llywelyn the Great, with Ralph Mortimer. In the Wigmore Chronicle, much is made of this marriage and the link to the Welsh princely dynasties it gave the Mortimers. The folio which you see here on the screen, the folio which records Gladys and Ralph's marriage, decorated in gold, red, blue and purple, is the most richly illuminated folio in the whole manuscript. And just a few years earlier, memories of that marriage can be shown to have been meaningful to the Welsh. In 1394, Roger Mortimer, having been granted livery of his lands after his minority, and about to embark for Ireland with the king as his lieutenant there, was addressed in a fulsome Welsh eulogy by Iolo Goch, a poet from Mortimer's lordship of Denbigh. In fact, the poem, in all likelihood, was prompted by a Mortimer steward of Denbigh, Philip ap Morgan, who came from an important line of Welsh poetic patrons. Iolo Goch, incidentally, the poet, has the best claim to be considered the household poet of Owain Glyndŵr. Now, the poem's ideological thrust foresaw that of the Wigmore manuscript, alluding to Mortimer's English, French and Welsh royal antecedents. The Gladys the marriage enabled the poet to portray Mortimer as the pure-blooded descendant of the Lord of Aberfraw, the Anglesey chief seat of the princes of Gwynedd. Very significantly too, Iolo addressed Mortimer as an edling, a medieval Welsh borrowing from the Old English ithling, meaning heir apparent. And just as significant too is a reference to opposition to Mortimer from English earls, his worthiness of crowned status being nevertheless emphasised. The poem, like the Wigmore Chronicle a few years later, clearly reflects the contention for the succession to a childless King Richard, the contention which featured during the 1390s. Both, the manuscript and the poem, in their different ways, were Mortimer propaganda items reflecting the family's ambitions in relation to the crown. Well, now, let us now fast forward to the year 1402. Henry IV was king since 1399, and Wales in revolt under Owain Glyndŵr, declared Prince of Wales at Glyndŵrdwy in 1400. 1402 was a good year for Glyndŵr. In April, his forces succeeded in capturing Lord Reginald Grey of Ruthyn, his arch-enemy, ransoming him for 10,000 marks, a huge sum, equal perhaps to over £3 million in our money. After Grey's capture, Glyndŵr assembled a large army and advanced into mid-Wales, probably intending to strike eventually at the south-east of the country. Now, in one source, the English prose boot, it's mentioned that he burnt Knighton in Mortimer territory, and it was probably this which prompted a response from Sir Edmund Mortimer, the leading member of his family. Mortimer advanced from Ludlow with a county levy of Herefordshire, supplemented with archers from his tenantry, including Welshmen from Meilienydd. The armies eventually met at Pilleth on Thursday, the feet of St Alban, the 22nd of June, 1402. Now, various attempts, notably by Geoffrey Hodges, Peter and Dan Snow, the American scholar Michael Livingstone, or recently by Craig Owen Jones, whose book is on sale at the back of the room, various attempts have been made to chart Mortimer and Glyndŵr's routes to Pilleth, and also to trace the course of the battle. Although all these writings are interesting, they are, to a large extent, inevitably speculative, and I desist from citing them, preferring to confine my account to chronicle evidence, supplemented by the evidence, admittedly scanty, of recent archaeology. Well now, first of all, the location of the battle. It was evidently fought on high ground, on one of the mountains beside Pilleth, where a certain image of the Blessed Virgin Mary was greatly honoured, according to the Chronicle Historia Vitae compiled at Evesham, possibly as early as 1403. This would place the battle near the church of Pilleth, which is dedicated to St. Mary. A passage in the Wigmore Chronicle, the Fundatorum Historia, possibly dating some decades later than the main part of the work, chimes with this, locating the battle on the mountain called Bryn Glas, super montem vocatum Bryn Glas, which overlooks the church. The Chronicle's close Mortimer affinities imparts some authority to this account. Then an unpublished chronicle, now in the Cambridge University Library, written by a rich Oxford brewer called Nicholas Bishop, sometime before 1432, a virtually unknown but most important source, provides invaluable details of the battle not otherwise recorded, and possibly deriving from an eyewitness account. Nicholas Bishop's chronicle places the battle on a mountain with a spring, or possibly a well, and on the right-hand side of an adjacent mountain. The fonts of the Latin original could mean a spring or well. Was the feature mentioned here perhaps the holy well in Pilleth churchyard, which would again point to the battle being on nearby Bryn Glas. But the battle need not to have been confined to Bryn Glas. Some manuscripts of the English prose boat, some manuscripts of the boat, placed the battle on other high ground, namely on the Black Hill, a hill immediately to the northwest of Bryn Glas. Interestingly, one of the manuscripts which contain this particular passage, a Rawlinson manuscript in the Bodleian Library, derives from Uwais Lacy in Herefordshire, a Mortimer territory. The reference to the Black Hill could represent local Herefordshire and Mortimer tradition, preserving a genuine memory of a battle which may have merged across not only Bryn Glas, but also the nearby Black Hill, or the Bryn D in Welsh. Well now, an 1847 account in Archaeologia Cambrensis by Evan Williams, a Knighton solicitor, tells of large quantities of bones dug up in the churchyard of Pilleth, more than what might be expected from the few burials of a thinly populated rural parish. Williams attributed this to the casualties of the battle. Another account by J.A. Bradley, writing in 1923, claimed that many bones had been found on the slope of Bryn Glas in the 1870s, prompting a local landowner, Sir Richard Green Price, to plant a stand of fir trees on the spot to commemorate the dead. Some of these trees are still there today. But these discoveries are not otherwise documented. Poorly documented too are 19th century claims of military items allegedly found near the battle site, such as a breastplate displayed in a meeting of the Cambrian Archaeological Association at Ludlow in 1852. Someone also found a cannonball, which it was claimed was associated with the battle, but that is certainly highly unlikely. Between 2012 and 2014, archaeological investigations on behalf of the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Wales took place on the slopes of Bryn Glas and in adjacent areas. No further traces of bones were found near the fir trees. The medieval finds of these investigations were extremely few, but significantly perhaps, a couple of medieval iron horseshoes and a copper alloy horse cheek piece was found on the slopes of Bryn Glas. Now, the archaeologists' findings, though meagre, did provide valuable correctives to some previous claims about the battle. The OS first edition 25-inch map of the area located the battle down in the low-lying meadows between the B4356 road and the River Lug. to be followed by the Royal Commission's Radnorshire Inventory in 1913, which also identified some mounds, the Cuckoo Pen mounds, along the north side of the Lug as, to quote, probably the burial place of the slain. It was probably the mounds which prompted the Ordnance Survey to locate the battle on the valley floor. But significantly, the archaeological investigation of the mounds in 2013 conclusively showed them to be natural features of clay and gravel. So all in all, we can safely conclude, I think, that the Battle of 1402 took place on high ground, certainly on the slopes of Bryn Glas, possibly spreading beyond onto the Black Hill. Well now, how large were the forces which met at Pilleth? Thomas Walsingham talks of a mob, turba, of Welshmen, faced by almost the whole of the knighthood of Herefordshire. But he gives no numbers. But some numbers are supplied by the neglected chronicle of Nicholas Bishop. He says that Mortimer had 220 lances and 3,000 archers, whilst, surprisingly, Glyndŵr had 8,000 men. Well, now, did Bishop or his source perhaps inflate Glyndŵr's numbers to excuse Mortimer's defeat? That certainly is possible. But a Welsh chronicle of the 15th century does say that Glyndŵr had a large force, llu mawr. Nicholas Bishop's chronicle uniquely provides another detail. Glyndŵr's army, he said, was divided into two wings. One of them, composed of between 1,000 and 1,200 men, and which had a crucial role in the battle, commanded by Rhys ap Tudur of Penmynydd, Anglesey, Glyndŵr's kinsman, renowned for capturing Conwy Castle with his brother Gwilym at Easter 1401. Bishop also cites another Glyndŵr commander as Rhys ap Gruffudd, but this is probably a mistake for Rhys Gethin, the redoubtable Rhys the Fierce of Pilleth, mentioned by other chronicles as being present at the battle. The Welsh lineup was impressive, but so was the opposition. That almost sounds like a description of a rugby match. Edmund Mortimer, though only 26 years old, was not an insubstantial figure, and I would like to emphasize that. Neither was he a military greenhorn. It can certainly be assumed that he'd acquired active military experience in Ireland, then a turbulent theatre of war, when he served there with his brother Roger. A serious indexing error in the relevant calendar of patent rolls has misled historians, including some very distinguished historians, and obscured the fact that in 1397, during his brother's absence in England, Edmund actually served as the King's Lieutenant in Ireland, the chief military and administrative office of the English colonial order there. Later, in 1398, he was deputy to his brother there. Then, in 1401, during the war with Glyndŵr, it was probably Edmund's military experience that led Henry Hotspur, his brother-in-law, to recommend him to the king as one of the leaders of a proposed three-pronged attack on Glyndŵr in North Wales. So Edmund Mortimer, as I said, was no military greenhorn. He certainly had military experience. And his own military experience notwithstanding, Mortimer undoubtedly had experienced soldiers in his army. Men like Sir Walter Devereux of Webley, Sir Kyned de la Bear of Kinnersley, Sir Robert Whitney of Whitney-on-Wye, and Sir Thomas Cranvow of Yesor, he being a descendant of Hywel ap Meirig, of whom we've heard a lot today. Now, these were all men who had served in English armies in Scotland and Ireland, and who, in the case of Devereux, de la Bear and Cranvow, had already served against Glyndŵr. At Pilleth, Glyndŵr's army faced a force of no little distinction. Now, from the chronicles, we can trace the outline of the course of the battle. Owain's force, deployed in two wings, according to Nicholas Bishop, occupied the high ground on Bryn Glas, and it appears that Mortimer's army, to, quote, fearlessly ascended the said mountain, as the Evesham Chronicle, the Historia Vitae, put it. There were medieval precedents, mostly unhappy, of uphill charges against opponents on higher ground. But a number of chronicles unite to make it clear that it wasn't only territorial advantage which won the day, which won the day for Glyndŵr, but rather an act of treachery within Mortimer's army, one which must have been premeditated. According to Walsingham, archers turned their bows on their own force. The Historia Vitae identified these as Welshmen of Meilienydd, descended, he says, from the line of the traitor Judas. Well, now, could Mortimer perhaps be accused of poor military intelligence? The return of clerical taxes due 2 days after the battle noted how taxes could not be collected from 10 churches in the Mortimer lands of Meilienydd and Gwerthrynion, as the erectors were, quote, enemies and rebels of the king. Was Mortimer unaware that his archers came from districts which had, in effect, largely gone over to Glyndŵr? At Bryn Glas, his lack of awareness made him a naive victim of Welsh desires to redress old wrongs and to wreak ethnic revenge. Now, in view of Bryn Glas, it's perhaps no wonder that chroniclers subsequently associated bloody portents, perceived as a bad omen, with Mortimer's birth. Estimates of English casualties vary. We can ignore Adam Usk's claims of 8,000 killed. He was an exile in Rome when the battle was fought and didn't write his account until 12 years later. The Chronicle of Dewlacres Abbey in Staffordshire estimated 1,500 casualties. Thomas Walsingham claimed that 1,100 were killed. More credible, perhaps, is the Historia Vitae's around 400. The unpublished Chronicle of Nicholas Bishop, a unique source, as I've said, for some details of the battle, significantly, perhaps, cites a precise 380. Now, we know the names of some of the more prominent casualties. Sir Robert Whitney, Sir Kenneth de la Bear, Sir Walter Devereux, who died from his injuries 3 days later. Sir Thomas Clanvow survived, but like Edmund Mortimer, was taken prisoner. Now, the psychological blow to Herefordshire's county elite must have been immense. All those cited had been both sheriffs and members of Parliament for the county. Nicholas Bishop's chronicle added the names of 7 other fallen notables, but the only one I've identified so far was John Hicklet, no doubt a relation of Sir Leonard Hicklet, a very close associate of the Mortimers for years, and the Sheriff of Herefordshire, indeed, in 1402. Now, chronicle accounts of the battle made dark and angry allegations. The Historia Vitae singled out Rhys Gethin of Pilleth as one who either killed or mutilated or captured all those resisting him, and alleged that bloodied bodies lay amongst the feet of the horses, being forbidden to be buried for a long time afterwards. Thomas Walsingham claimed that payment was demanded before the bodies were allowed burial. But more famously, he alleged that there was obscene desecration of English corpses by Welsh female camp followers, involving the cutting off of genitalia and worse. And like the previous speaker, I'll spare you the details. Now, this may have been black propaganda, as the Australian scholar Dr. Alicia Merchant has suggested. It may have been an attempt to emphasise the barbaric otherness of the Welsh. Walsingham had form in this respect in 1379, when the Scots invaded parts of northern England. Walsingham claimed that they played football with the heads of decapitated Englishmen, be that as it may. But terrible things, of course, as we know, even from looking at television these days, terrible things do happen in battles and wars. perhaps the jury must forever be out in this particular case. Now, after the battle, Glyndŵr's capture of a prisoner as valuable as Edmund Mortimer dictated a swift return with his surely traumatized captive to territory under his secure control. The Historia Vitae refers to the mountains and caves of Snowdonia, a not implausible guess. Intriguingly, perhaps, it must be wondered if Mortimer encountered Glyndŵr's other prestigious prisoner, Lord Reginald Grey, captured since April. As to Mortimer's treatment, although Walsingham speaks of his dreadful captivity, and John Harding's verse chronicle has him lying in chains, he lay in chains and gravely in prison, the Historia Vitae, perhaps written within a year of Bryn Glas, says that Glyndŵr treated Mortimer very humanely and respectfully, as befitted his standing. Mindful, too, of his importance in relation to the succession to the crown of England. A class affinity between captor and captive, and Glyndŵr's familiarity with the conventions of chivalry, makes this credible. But what of Mortimer's eventual fate? One historian has termed this very period, the turn of the 14th century to the 15th century, the golden age of ransom culture. Mortimer, like the eventually expensively released Lord Grey, was an asset of huge potential profit for Glyndŵr, whose cause needed ample resourcing. In November 1402, Grey was released for ransom. By then, too, Sir Thomas Clanvow, like Mortimer captured at Bryn Glas, was back in circulation. But Mortimer's case was different. 3 days after the battle, an outraged Henry IV had written about the capture of his, quote, very dear and well-beloved cousin, Edmund Mortimer. But these words breathed hypocrisy. The king's reluctance to pay a no doubt huge ransom for Mortimer, despite the urging of Henry Hotspur, Mortimer's brother-in-law, soon became apparent. We know that the king's coffers at this time were severely depleted, but it was no doubt Mortimer's position as the representative of a potential rival dynasty that explained Henry's reluctance. It suited him to have Mortimer out of the way. Thomas Walsingham told an absurd story that Mortimer had planned his own capture as an agreed and premeditated act of treason. Well, fake news is not an exclusively modern phenomenon. By mid-October 1402, the king was already confiscating silver vessels and jewels that had belonged to Mortimer. The rest is well known. The Evesham Chronicle recorded that on the 30th of November, St. Andrew's Day, Mortimer solemnly married an unnamed daughter of Owain's. We know her to be Catherine, a momentous union indeed. 13 days later, Mortimer wrote to former associates indicating his support for his new father-in-law. He maintained that Owain's grievances would be remedied if King Richard were alive, and there were rumours, of course, that he was, or, if not, the rightful heir to the crown, Mortimer's nephew, Edmund, son of Roger Mortimer, would become King of England. Glyndŵr was now embroiled in the dangerous game of English dynastic politics, and Mortimer's fate was irretrievably tied to the cause of the rebel Prince of Wales. Now, I'll go on from there, I think. There we are, right. Well, now, popular perception of Mortimer's marriage to Catherine Glyndŵr is inevitably coloured by its depiction in Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 1. Whilst Mortimer is made to regret, my wife can speak no English, I no Welsh, their portrayal is that of a love-lorn couple. Lovingly, Mortimer tells his wife, but I will never be a truant, love, till I have learnt thy language, for thy tongue makes Welsh as sweet as ditties highly penned, sung by a fair queen in a summer's bower, with ravishing division to her lute. Glyndŵr then bids Mortimer to rest your gentle head upon her lap. Well, now, am I being too cynical in wondering if this romantic picture is the whole story? What choice did Mortimer have? A prisoner with dynastic connections that made him deeply suspect of the king and unlikely to be ransomed, he would have been vulnerable not merely to Welsh female charm, but even more so perhaps to a degree of coercion. From Glyndŵr's standpoint, this marriage tied Mortimer hand and foot to his cause, with possible very positive prospects if Henry IV were eventually deposed. Mortimer's marriage, according to Walsingham, was because of weariness at his dreadful captivity or through fear of death, and was an inferior match that did not befit his noble position. And Adam Usk says as much, the marriage causing, he claimed, a great deal of murmuring amongst the people. But whether motivated by love or coercion, the consequences for Mortimer of his marriage and defection were inevitable. Over the next 2 years, the king systematically stripped him of his lands in numerous grants, often with the justifying clause because he was an adherent of Owain Glyndŵr and other Welsh rebels. A quick further word about the marriage. Oddly, it doesn't feature in a single one of the very many Welsh genealogical manuscripts I've seen, not a single one. In the 18th century, the great Welsh antiquarian Thomas Pennant even described the marriage as a mistake of the English historians. A defective text in some manuscripts of the English vote, in its day the most popular history in England, propagated the absurd error that Catrin married another of Glyndŵr's prisoners, Reginald Grey, who is sometimes called Henry Grey. Well, now, this error was taken up by Welsh genealogies and further circulated. So sadly, for the unfortunate Mortimer and Catrin, their marriage was expunged from the Welsh genealogical record. We don't know if Edmund Mortimer featured in any of Glyndŵr's military actions. He may have been too valuable an asset to risk in that way. He would have had high hopes of the Percy's rebellion in 1403. They supported the Mortimer claim to the crown. But such hopes, of course, were dashed in the fateful Battle of Shrewsbury. In February 1405, his alliance with Glyndŵr encouraged a plot which, if it had succeeded, would have had momentous results. It involved Lady Constance Despencer, a granddaughter of Edward III, whose husband had been killed in a revolt against Henry IV in 1400. Using a duplicate key, Lady Despencer released Edmund and Roger, the young sons of Roger IV Earl of March, from Windsor Castle, where they had been kept in benevolent custody as the king's wards. She took them away, intending to unite them with her uncle Edmund Mortimer and Glyndŵr in Wales, but the fleeing party was caught near Cheltenham. If Edmund and Glyndŵr had obtained control of the elder boy, his father's heir, the threat to Henry IV, faced with a rival claimant to the throne at liberty and in the hands of his enemies, would have been grave indeed. Now, within a fortnight of the aborted escape of the boys on the 28th of February, an initiative of unique boldness was launched by Glyndŵr and Mortimer in alliance with Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, alienated from Henry IV since the revolt of 1403. I refer, of course, to the Tripartite Indenture, or three-party agreement, a treaty where the three of them declared mutual support and set out their ambitions. The text, amounting to a manifesto, declared that if it were to appear that the three of them were indeed the persons referred to in a prophecy about the division of Britain, and in the Middle Ages, of course, the land was awash with prophecies which had popular credence and potency, they would strive to realise a breathtaking aim. This was no less than the division of the realm into three independent dominions, one each to Owain, Mortimer and Percy, within what would have been a confederated kingdom. Now, such a radical plan, of course, presupposed the overthrow of Henry IV. The core of the text specified the proposed territorial division. Percy was to have the north of England, with a southern extension to the Midlands, which reached eastwards to include Norfolk. Mortimer was to have the whole of southern England from Suffolk to Cornwall. But by far the most interesting territorial division, and the one defined in most detail, was the one assigned to Glyndŵr. He was to have not only Wales as usually conceived, but a much expanded Wales, extending between the Severn and Mersey estuaries, and reaching eastwards to include the whole of Cheshire, Shropshire and Herefordshire, and even parts of Gloucestershire, Worcestershire and Staffordshire. This was a Wales not of 15th century reality, but a greater Wales imagined through the prism of ancient legend, prophecies and history, one evocative of a very distant past, of Brythonic rule way beyond the confines of late medieval Wales. Now, part of the eastern border of Owain's extended Wales was specified as running from the north gate of Worcester to Onnenau Meigion, the ash trees of Meigion, near Bridge North. Very significantly, these Onnenau Meigion, the ash trees of Meigion, featured in prophecies as a place where the great eagle would muster Welsh armies. Meigion probably derived from the name Maig, a 6th century prince cited in poetry as a distant ancestor of Owain. It has been plausibly argued that it is likely that Owain was the true mover of the agreement. The influence of his very able chancellor, Gruffudd when 1404 had negotiated an alliance with France, the influence of Gruffudd on its content and wording is very likely. This has been very strongly argued recently by the American historian Michael Livingston. As to Edmund Mortimer, it is interesting that the agreement ceded all of the Mortimer ancestral territory in the March to Owain. Mortimer's position in relation to his father-in-law was weak and vulnerable, and it must be wondered whether this ceding of territory was wholly voluntary. And as his nephew, the young Mortimer heir and claimant to the throne, was still alive but under royal control, was Sir Edmund's role in relation to the indenture really that of a stand-in or proxy? Be that as it may, the Tripartite Indenture was doomed to be a dead letter, the forlorn expression of an ambitious but unrealised political dream. With the death of Percy in 1408, and the gradual decline of Glyndŵr's revolt, brought about by military body blows, the submission of many parts of Wales to the authorities, economic pressures, and the drying up of French support, the indenture was reduced to the status of a mere historical curiosity, a monument to an extraordinary episode of Welsh political confidence and ambition never afterwards repeated. On another level, it was a marker of the dynastic ambitions of the Mortimers, not to be realised until the eventual triumph of the House of York in the Wars of the Roses. Now, in 1404, Glyndŵr had captured both Aberystwyth and Harlech castles, to the Welsh twin reminders of the Edwardian conquest of Wales. After a long siege, Aberystwyth fell in September 1408, and the besieging English army proceeded to Harlech. Now, this was the location of the penultimate scene of my story today, for in the castle sheltered Edmund Mortimer and his family, his wife Catherine, his son Lionel, and his 3 unnamed daughters, together with his mother-in-law, Margaret, wife of Owain Glyndŵr. We don't know whether Glyndŵr himself was there during the siege. He may have been. He had once held a parliament there, but at any rate, he succeeded in evading English capture. We owe our knowledge of Edmund and Catherine's children, including the name of their son Lionel, named after his great-grandfather, Lionel, Duke of Clarence, to the chronicle of Adam Usk. Adam owed much to the Mortimers. It was Edmund's father, the 3rd Earl of March, Lord of Usk, who had supported Adam's education at Oxford. Since 1402, Adam had been in exile, mostly as a lawyer in the papal curia in Rome. But rightful suspicion that he was a Glyndŵr sympathiser rendered his return to England problematic. But in 1408 he set sail from Brittany, bound for Barmouth in Merioneth, with the intention of meeting up with Glyndŵr supporters, aiming eventually to flee from them and seek a pardon. But that is another story. I think it is likely that having landed at Barmouth, Adam, mindful of his Mortimer affinities, met up with Edmund Mortimer and his family in Harlech Castle. In any case, Adam's chronicle is the only source who names any of Edmund and Catherine's children, and then only that of their son Lionel, a distinctive name of whose historical connotations Adam would have been acutely aware. The autumn and winter of 1408-09 saw the siege of Harlech Castle by an English army, an army of 300 men of arms and 600 archers. There was a setback to the English besiegers. A large cannon called the King's Daughter burst. But the combination of bombardment and the blockade of supplies took their toll on the Welsh defenders, who by February 1409 had been forced to yield. Amongst the siege's casualties was Edmund Mortimer. To quote Adam Usk, Edmund eventually ended his unhappy life in Harlech Castle, besieged by an English army. There was something maniacal, of course, about that. And he adds, interestingly, and these remarkable events are still to this day sung about at feasts. Edmund's burial place is unknown, but the identification of an effigy in St. Nicholas's Church in Montgomery as his, it's conjectural but not implausible. The Mortimer arms are displayed with a bend which shows that the person commemorated was not the head of his family as such. It's quite likely some friends of mine at Montgomery are still awaiting expert opinion as to the authenticity of this effigy. Well, now, following the fall of Harlech, the widowed Catherine and 3 of her daughters were taken prisoner and dispatched for imprisonment in the Tower of London, together with Margaret Hanmer, the wife of Glyndŵr. The party taken to London must have been a pitiable one. The Mortimer girls must have been very young children, for Edmund and Catherine had only been married for just over 6 years. Of the fate of the boy Lionel, we know nothing. We don't hear anything of the captives for 4 years, when there's a reference to them in June 1413 in the issue rolls of the Exchequer. The large sum of £30 was paid to a certain John Wheel for the expenses of the wife of Owain Glyndŵr, the wife of Edmund Mortimer, their sons and daughters in his custody in the city of London at the King's charge. Wheel was steward to the Earl of Arundel. One Welshman, maybe significantly, once called him False John Wheel. The reference to Margaret Hanmer is the last we hear of her. Owain's wife became one of the disappeared of the revolt, her fate unknown. The last we hear of Catherine and her children is a sombre record of the payment of the 1st of December to another Arundel official, William Delchaume. He was paid £1 for expenses and other charges incurred for the burial and exequies or funeral rites of the wife of Edmund Mortimer and her daughters, buried within St. Swithin's Church, London. And then in February 1414, John Wheel received back payments for his expenses in connection with their imprisonment. A Cardiff University historian, Dr. Gabriel Brough, has claimed that Catherine and her children were starved to death in the Tower. But there is no evidence for this, and the record of the payments gainsays this theory, unless, of course, the money was misappropriated. There was a plague outbreak in England in 1413, and it is much more likely, I think, that the unfortunate Catherine and her children fell victims to this. Their simultaneous deaths may point to this conclusion. A remark by Adam Usk in 1414 suggests that one of the 3 Mortimer girls may have survived, but this is uncertain. If she survived, her ultimate fate is unknown. Well, now, thanks to the successive catastrophes of the Great Fire of London in 1666 and the Blitz of the Second World War, the church of St. Swithin's, where Catherine Mortimer and her children were laid to rest, is no more. But on the site of the church stands the tiny St. Swithin's garden, very close to Cannon Street Tube Station. In 2001, in the garden, a memorial to Catherine and her children and to the sufferings of all mothers and children in wars was unveiled by the Welsh actress Sian Phillips. The garden and the memorial are now, alas, directly overlooked and utterly dominated by the huge 9-storey Walbrook office building built in 2007, built by a very distinguished architect, Sir Norman Foster, but I would characterise it as a ghastly steel monument to developmental greed and insensitive city planning. The coming together of Owain Glyndŵr and Edmund Mortimer, and the mingling of Glyndŵr and Mortimer blood with the children of Edmund and Catherine did not in any way, I'm afraid, have a happy ending, even in modern commemoration. The story of Owain Glyndŵr and Edmund Mortimer may no longer be sung about at feasts, but it remains a fascinating subplot in the history of medieval Wales and that of its neighbouring March. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.